In this video, we'll be installing a Tomato firmware build on an Asus router. This installation process is known as flashing, which is essentially installing software directly to the hardware of a device. We'll start by downloading a software utility from the Asus website. Then, we'll download the firmware and perform a factory reset on the router. This reset will clear the NVRAM and ensure a smooth installation. Then, we'll flash the router and clear the NVRAM once again to remove any settings that may have remained from the old firmware. First, go to the Asus website and click the Support tab. Then, enter your router's model number into the search box. In my case, I have an Asus RT N66U. Click the Downloads link and select your operating system. Under Utilities, locate and download the Asus Firmware Restoration Utility. After downloading the restoration utility, right-click on the file and extract the zip file. Then, click on the installation file to install the software. Now, let's download the correct firmware for the router. If you're not sure which firmware version you need, be sure to watch the video on compatibility to learn more about Tomato firmware mods, builds, and router compatibility. Since I already know which firmware version I need, I'll download it now from the developer's website. I'll be using the VPN mod built by Shibby. Shibby is one of the volunteer firmware developers for the Tomato project. Let's navigate to the Download menu and choose Tomato Firmware. I'll choose the K26 version and select the most recent build for the English language. Since I prefer the VPN version, I'll download that now. Okay, we've got our firmware and our restoration utility. But before we proceed, it's best to clear the NVRAM and reset the router before we flash it with the different firmware. There are several ways to do this, including from the admin panel, but we'll do it using the hardware. On the back of the router there are two buttons, WPS and Reset. To reset your router, simply power on the router with the WPS button pressed and hold it down for 10 seconds. Doing so will clear the NVRAM and return it to a factory state. This is also known as a hard reset, whereby the router's IP address is returned to the factory default IP address 192.168.1.1. So, if you ever run into trouble logging into your router, you can always perform a hard reset and use the default user ID and password to log in. The only downside to this is that you lose any settings you've configured, so you'll have to reconfigure your router. Once the router resets, connect it to your computer using an Ethernet cable. Plug one end into your computer and the other end into one of the LAN ports on the back of the router. Once you're connected, the next step is to assign a static IP address to the network interface controller on your computer. In Windows 7, open the Control Panel and navigate to the Network and Sharing Center. Click Change Adapter Settings. Right-click on the Network Interface Controller and choose Properties. Select IPv4 and choose Properties once again. Select the button Use the following address. Enter an IP address such as 192.168.1.9. The subnet mask should be 255.255.255.0. The default gateway is simply the IP address of your router, so enter 192.168.1.1. Now select Use the following DNS server. Unless you are using a custom DNS server, simply enter the IP address of your router. Click OK to save your settings. One thing to be aware of when changing the IP address, be sure that you are changing the Ethernet controller and not the wireless network controller. Now let's prepare to flash our router. Open the Asus Firmware Recovery utility and upload the Tomato firmware that you downloaded earlier. Do not click Upload yet. At this point, all we're doing is getting the software in place and ready to be deployed. Before we actually upload the firmware, let's first put the router into recovery mode. This time, we'll press and hold the reset button and power on the router. Wait until the power LED light begins to blink on the front of the router and then release the reset button. Once the blue LED power light begins to blink on the front of the device, you will only have a few seconds to begin flashing your router, so you'll need to act fast. Once your router is in recovery mode, go back to the recovery utility quickly and press the upload button to begin flashing the router. Whatever you do, do not interrupt this process. It may take a few minutes, so be patient. In fact, it's recommended to wait a minimum of 10 minutes to give the router a chance to adjust. After a full 10 minutes have passed, unplug the router and clear the NVRAM once again to remove any settings that may have remained from the old firmware. Plugging the power cord back into the router while holding the WPS button for 10 seconds will clear the NVRAM. Now, let's log into the router. Simply open your internet browser and enter the IP address 192.168.1.1. You should be prompted to log in. The default login ID and password for Tomato firmware is admin or root admin. Now, you can configure your router as necessary. If you need help configuring the Tomato firmware, be sure to check out my other video on how to set up a Tomato router. Okay, let's recap the 9 steps that we've covered in this video. First, we downloaded the ASUS firmware restoration utility. We then downloaded the Tomato firmware. We performed a hard reset to clear the NVRAM. We gave our PC a static private IP address. We opened the recovery utility and preloaded the Tomato firmware. We then put the router into recovery mode and quickly uploaded the firmware. We waited 10 minutes and reset the NVRAM once again to clear any settings that may have remained. And finally, we've logged into our router successfully.